Hey, appendicular skeleton, still part of the skeletal system. We've talked about bone tissue. We've talked about the axial skeleton. Here we're talking about bones of the arms and the legs, as well as the pectoral girdle and the pelvic girdle. Next chapter, we'll be talking about the joints, articulations, all part of the skeletal system. So we'll be understanding the function of our appendages, our arms and our legs, and identifying the different bones of the pelvic girdle, pectoral girdle and arms, pelvic girdle and legs, naming every single bone and specific bone features. Just like we went over different bone features, bone markings in the last chapter, we'll be doing the same thing here. Your textbook shows a ton more bone features than we will be going over. The ones that I specify and the ones that are listed on the chapter study guide are the ones that you should know for this class. One thing I want you to think about, as always, is how the structure of these things relate to its function. When we look at bones, bones have specific markings, and these markings relate to, what they attach to, what they articulate with. Related to this idea is that shoulder dislocation is common. It's a very common reason to go to the ER. In terms of dislocations, it's 45%. It accounts for 45%. It's a very high percentage for all dislocations. Why is this number so high specifically for shoulder dislocation? Why is it, say, a hip dislocation more common? It's definitely possible to get a hip dislocation, but why isn't it more common? We're going to take a look as we go through this chapter why this would be, and pay close attention to bone markings and just physically what would cause a dislocation, what would cause it to be more likely in one area than another. When we say appendicular skeleton, we're referring to a lot of bones, 126. I know that sounds like a lot, but when we get to the hands and the feet, you're going to be saying the same thing over and over and over again. Just one's going to be number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or proximal, medial, or distal. So these account for a lot of them. It sounds like a lot, but the naming system makes sense, and I hope it makes it easier for you. We're talking about the pectoral girdle. The word girdle means a support. So the pectoral girdle, the one supporting your arm, is your clavicle, your collarbone, and your scapula. And then your arm. Your arm includes your brachial region, antebrachial region, olecratal, antecubital, carpal, and manual, and phalangeal, everything that's included in your hand. And then your leg is your pelvic girdle, which is your hips, and the term for your hip bones, your coxal bones. And then your lower limbs, which include your femoral region, your patellar, popliteal region, crural, sural region, tarsal, and pedal regions, and everything that's included with pedal. So once again, it sounds like a lot. There's a lot of bones, but we're going to have some ways for you to remember all of them and have it make some more sense for you. We'll start with the scapula and clavicle in this video. The scapula is your shoulder blade, so you can feel it most on the back of your body, the posterior side. And your clavicle is your collarbone, so it's more, you can feel it on the anterior side of your body. They form your pectoral girdle. We'll take a look at complete anatomy in a second, and you'll see the relationship between the two. What they both do together is that they help stabilize your arm. Specifically, they stabilize your humerus. The humerus is the main bone of your brachial region. And also with the help of stabilization from your sternum, since your sternum is very medial. And the sternum, again, is part of that axial skeleton. The clavicle articulates at 2 points. The medial portion articulates at the manubrium of the sternum. So this is called the sternal end. while the other end, it articulates at the scapula. You could call this the scapular end, but more accurately, the protrusion, the bone marking of the scapula is called the acromion process. So this part is called the acromial end. So there's a sternal end and a acromial end. We will take a look at how to identify the difference between the two. The scapula, it looks like it articulates with the ribs. It does not directly articulate with the ribs. There are muscles and other tissues in between the two. The scapula does not articulate with the ribs. It only articulates with two bones. Despite being such a large bone, it only articulates with two bones. It articulates with the clavicle at its acromion process, and it articulates with the humerus at the glenoid fossa. Let's take a look at complete anatomy to identify all these different things, among others that are listed in the chapter study guide, the chapter 8 study guide. All right. So here we are. I want to show you this superior view a little bit off to the side. Look at how, on this right side of the body, look at the shape of the clavicle. What I just traced is the clavicle, the right clavicle, and then here in green, and going down a little farther, that's the scapula. They're almost forming together with the vertebrae and the sternum, almost forming a triangle. A very strong shape. But the scapula only articulates with the clavicle and the humerus. The clavicle only articulates with the scapula and the sternum. Overall, let's look at the clavicle first. The clavicle has a very unique shape. It's got this S-type curvature. It starts here, goes back, and then comes forward again. If we look from an anterior view, we can see, let's look from a little bit more of a superior view again. It's articulating at that clavicular notch of the manubrium of the sternum. This end is the sternal end of the clavicle. This end over here is the acromial end. When you're just looking at it from, like, if you have a disarticulated bone, if you have the bone isolated, how can you tell the difference? You should be able to. You will learn to be able to, and I'll expect you to do this on the practical. But if you're just looking at a single bone, how do you know which side is which? This end here, it's round if you're looking straight at it. If you look at it on its edge, it's kind of straight. So it's kind of like a flat, round nail head. That's always going to be the sternal end. Round like a nail head is the sternal end. If it's round in a different way, round and flat like a spoon, that's the acromial end. Let me show you a different angle. See how it's flat from this view? It's roundish, but it's not round like a nail. It's round like a, or kind of flat and rounded. That's the acromial end. That's what will articulate with the clavicle, or this part of the clavicle is what's going to articulate with the scapula. The inferior portion of the bone is always going to have this rough bump. I'm not going to have you name this bump, but this side is pointing inferior. The smoother side is superior. Sternal is medial. Acromial is lateral. So we figured out superior, inferior, lateral, medial. Sides of the bone. If we're looking from a superior view, this is medial, this is lateral. If we're looking from a superior view, how do we know which way is anterior or which way is posterior? Start from the medial side. If you start over here, you want to come out first. See how it's going this way, the curvature? Let me use a different color. From the medial side, you always want to come out, then in, then out again. That's how you know you're on the anterior side. It curves away, back in, and away. Feel this on your own collarbone. There's a bulge pointing anteriorly, back posteriorly, then anteriorly at the shoulder, at the acromial end. Putting all that together, you can figure out that this is a right clavicle. It takes practice. It'll make more sense too when we get to handle it in lab. This is the right clavicle. Look at this articulation between the clavicle and the scapula right here. This protrusion, this is the acromion process. This is your acromioclavicular joint, the joint that lets you shrug your shoulders up and down, elevate, depress. Also protract and retract. That's this joint. The joint to move your arm like this, that's a different joint. That joint is right here. It's hiding a little bit. It's formed with the head of this humerus. The space of the scapula, which I'll show you in a second, isolated, it's the glenoid fossa. So this would form the glenohumeral joint. Let's look at this part of the scapula. Let's look at this part of the scapula from the back, posterior side. The medial edge is always very long. The medial edge is always very long. There's a lot going on the lateral side. You got protrusion, kind of masked here, but there's a flat part. We'll name these in a minute. Inferior is always pointing down. You've got this sharp edge pointing down. All these protrusions are also on the superior portion. So that's how you figure out the sides. The term for this ridge going this way, the term for this ridge is the spine. This is the scapular spine. We're in a posterior view. That sharp ridge going across is the scapular spine. You can see this hollow portion right here, this fossa right here. It's above the spine. So this is called the supraspinous fossa. That space up there. We're going to learn about a muscle that sits in that spot. Below the spine, you have a bigger fossa right here. It's infraspinous fossa, where more muscles sit. This spine continues anteriorly, and that protrusion anteriorly is what articulates with the clavicle. This is the acromion process. The acromion process articulates with the clavicle. It's an extension of the spine that goes more anteriorly. To prove that, I'm going to clear this and rotate up a little bit. There's that spine acromion process. And here's the space for the supraspinous fossa. You can see that there's this part here that articulates with the head of the humerus. Look at how nice and round the head of the humerus is. This fossa is not that round. It doesn't really match the roundness of the head of the humerus. I'm going to isolate the scapula so you can see it better. This is an anterior view. This part, which is very lateral, because it has to fit the head of the humerus, this is the glenoid fossa. Here's a more anterior view, slightly more anterior. This large space, this large space here is another fossa. It's much bigger than the other two that we just saw because it takes up the whole side. But this is called the subscapular fossa. Not the most intuitive name for this one. Subscapular. On the other side, you had supraspinous fossa and infraspinous fossa. On the anterior side, you have the subscapular fossa. The most superior lateral protrusion, this one here, that's the acromion process still. This other one here, this is not an articulation with another bone, it's an attachment for muscles. Your biceps brachii, for instance, attaches here. It originates here. This protrusion is called the coracoid process. Coracoid process. Coracoid means crow-like. You can think of this as looking like a crow's beak or a perch for a bird to sit on. Either way. Coracoid process. Clearing this. Putting all that together, we can figure out which side this is. We know this long edge is medial. We know the glenoid fossa is lateral. We know that all of this up here is superior. This point's inferior. If there's only one big fossa, we're on the anterior side. We put all that together, we can know that this is the right scapula. If you have the anterior side facing you, glenoid fossa is to our left, medial edge is to the right. There's more than one way you can orient it, but in order to figure out that it's the right or the left, but you have to start with some kind of frame of reference, such that if I put the other scapula also with the anterior side facing me, this would be more shaped like this. If the anterior side was facing me, medial is now to the left, glenoid fossa is to the right, inferior is still pointing down, superior is still pointing up. It's like when you're looking at two different shoes, they look the same, but they're mirrored. Of course, get more practice with that in class. So that makes up your pectoral girdle, the clavicle and the scapula. In the next videos, we'll go over the rest of the arm, then the pelvic girdle and the rest of the leg. So I will see you in the next videos. Let me know if you have questions. Please leave questions and comments in the discussion.